welcome to our Protected Reflections event, Digital Poverty Students Left Behind, how a lack of access to a core digital infrastructure risks disruption and failure for some students. Thank you for taking the time for joining us today. We'll be running a live Q&A with our speakers at the end of the session. So we've enabled the Q&A feature in Zoom. So if you've got any questions, just please put them in there and we'll ask them at the end. I'm Lisa Ravenscroft, the Communications Manager here at ProtectED, and I'm very pleased to welcome today's speakers. Leslie O'Keefe, who's Registrar at Brunel University London, which is a protected founder member university, and she's also a MOSHI executive member. Mari Underwood, who is Head of Student Voice and Diversity at the Student Room Group, which is the largest online engagement platform for students in the UK. So this morning we'll be discussing the impact of digital poverty on student retention, exploring measures that can reduce the risk of students leaving their courses early, and our speakers will also share their thoughts, insights and recommendations for future developments in the university support. So Leslie and Mari, welcome. Thank you again for joining us. So first question is, firstly, can you tell us a little bit about your organisation or university team and how you are involved in digital poverty? Leslie, are you okay to go first with that one?
Sure, thanks Lisa. So as Lisa said, I'm Leslie, I'm the Registrar at Brunel University London. We are a campus-based university in West London and we have around 16,500 students. My role in relation to digital poverty this year, and the reason I'm being invited to speak on this panel, is actually more in relation to my MOSHI role, where I led a CPD session on digital poverty. And what we did for that session is we carried out some research amongst all our member organisations in MOSHI, and during that CPD event we were able to share some of our findings. So I will be able to share some of those with you this morning. I might also draw, if I may, then on some of my more personal experience in my own university and our own work, although I probably should admit that some of the projects done by some of the people we spoke with in our research were probably better and more interesting than our own. But I'll try and share those as we develop through the morning. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Leslie. Over to you, Mari.
Thank you, Lisa. So my name is Mari and I'm Head of Student Voice and Diversity at the Student Room. So the Student Room, as Lisa was saying, is a big old platform for students in the UK, and we get international students as well, from about 14 to 24 years of age. We get about 10 million visits a month, and we think that about 75% of UK students use the Student Room, and it's predominantly a peer-to-peer platform. So in terms of sort of what I'm bringing to the session today is really to represent what students themselves are saying and kind of the experience that they're having. I'm certainly not a policy expert, but I'm definitely here to kind of bring that voice and sort of make sure that we're sort of contextualizing everything that we're talking about with those experiences of young people. And for me personally, I've worked at TSR for the past just over 4 years. And prior to that, I was a secondary school teacher and a head of year. So all of this stuff around students is really just my jam and the thing that excites me. So I'm very glad to be here today to chat with you.
Thanks, ladies. So second question, with the vast majority of students going home at the beginning of the COVID-19 lockdown last year, people became more aware of digital poverty as actually something that was happening. What are the biggest problems that you've both seen over the last year with students? So Leslie, do you want to go first again?
Sure. So from our university, from Brunel's point of view, straight away we went to access to laptops and being able to access our online delivery, and that's what we thought was the main emerging problem. But I mentioned a bit earlier about the MOSHI research that we did, and I thought this was really fascinating. One of the questions that we asked in that research is, what does digital poverty mean to you? And the breadth of answers was really quite wide and surprised us, and I'll share some of that with you now. So 81% of respondents said that problematic internet access, so a bit like us, went straight to the technology questions. And then the second answer, that 69%, was lack of equipment and hardware. But some of the other things that came down, and the percentages were lower, and it was on a sliding scale, but some of these I had never even thought of. There was no access to the required software, lack of knowledge or skills or confidence in using the digital platform, an inability to participate, or I felt a feeling of exclusion on the impact of learning. Shared equipment, so that is one that we had thought about. You will hear that a lot on the media, particularly in school-age children. There were lots of stories around that and the complexities. We had some universities say that actually students had equipment, but actually it was poor quality or it was outdated, so it just wasn't good enough for what we were starting to use. But then some of the other ones, which were things that probably had not occurred to me, I wouldn't have wrapped under digital poverty, was actually around shared or unsuitable workspaces. So we're probably very aware of that when it comes to our colleagues, and we probably all know somebody who has spent the last year sat on the end of their bed with their laptop, and we're just thinking, what kind of back pain are they going to experience? But actually that's the same problem for our students, because some of them just don't have the luxury of a corner of the room or their house that they can put a table in, or even if they do, they might not be able to afford the table to put in the corner. So it's just so multi-layered. And then the one that really shocked me and came out in some of the conversations that we had in the research was around inappropriate devices. So actually there were a number of students at universities that found that were writing their 2,000 word assignment on their mobile phones. Like, I cannot even get my head around this. I mean, if I've got to write anything longer than about 10 words, I'm on my laptop on the email because I just can't bear it. So I just thought that the breadth of descriptions of areas impacted under digital poverty was really broad. And Mari, you could probably provide a bit more context of what our students were saying in that respect.
Yeah, definitely. So I feel like I'm nodding my head a lot because what you're saying is resonating a lot with me. I think from my perspective, there's three things that I think have come across really strongly from a student perspective. Firstly, when the lockdowns originally started happening, we noticed just an insane growth in how much online platforms like ours were needed. As soon as students went home, there was a huge amount of support services and all sorts of things that they didn't have access to anymore. And this was in a time where things changed so drastically in their education, and they were trying to come to grips and trying to understand that, but they didn't have the support networks that would have helped them to understand changes like that in the real world. So a lot of them turned to online. So we're talking about digital poverty. And I think something to remember is that digital poverty impacted people before the pandemic, but digital became so much more important during the pandemic. So that impact on those people was exacerbated a huge amount in terms of having to rely on that access to digital, and not just the access, but the literacy around digital technology and access. So I think that there was a real sort of solidifying of a problem that already existed in terms of making it much more of a problem for those people who didn't have access to services online. Secondly, the lack of digital access doesn't just impact educational attainment. So we saw a huge impact across TSR in terms of, for example, relationships that became really difficult when the real life element of those relationships was removed. And they had to try and enact those relationships online, whether it's friendships or, romantic relationships. That sense of that disconnect from the real world was difficult for a lot of young people. And if you aren't a young person who has really easy and immediate and constant access to technology, to social media, etc., it would become very easy for your support circle, your peer circle, in terms of friendships and relationships to fall apart at a really key time for students where that's not something that we want to be happening. But in terms of those students who already were at a disadvantage, I'm looking at the research from the Education Policy Institute that was saying that the attainment gap for students between students who are disadvantaged has actually stopped closing for the first time in 10 years. And now those disadvantaged students are 18 months behind their peers by GCSE. And that was based on 2019 data. So if we're talking about what's happened since then, how much has the pandemic really impacted that educational attainment side of things for those disadvantaged students? And lastly, I just wanted to touch on the fact that there's a lot of things, and this speaks, Leslie, to what you were saying around sort of the really wide spectrum of what digital poverty really means to people. There's a really, really wide spectrum in terms of the quality and the quantity of digital engagement that students have been able to have over the past 12 to 18 months. So just as an example, at the beginning of the first lockdown, we had on TSL, we run polls, and 28% of students told us that they were at a disadvantage compared to others when studying from home. So that was at the beginning of the first lockdown. By the start of lockdown 3, which was at the beginning of this year, that had increased to 43% of students who told us they didn't have what they needed to succeed in home learning. So there's a lot of reasons that that could be the case. It could be that we've all realized what home learning actually entails now. It could be any number of things, but it's interesting that that sense of awareness about how well they're able to access online learning had really increased by lockdown 3. And as Leslie was saying, there's lots of reasons. So I just wanted to give a few examples from the forums. So sharing devices was something that came up a lot. And one of our users said, I have a laptop, but my sister has to use it a lot because she doesn't have a laptop, so we've got to share it. Another person said, I work from my bed. The lack of printing facilities is really irritating. And my connection on Meets lets me down at least once a lesson. So their connection was dropping out. And then looking at people who are in things like temporary housing, for example. So this student says they were placed in a hotel by the council. There's not a table in the room. They're using their learning device from bed. All their belongings, all their possessions are all around them. And they're saying that libraries are closed, so they can't access books either. So there's a huge spectrum from, you know, sharing devices to not having printer facilities to not being able to access, you know, to being in really difficult real world situations that really sort of exacerbate those challenges that they're already having in relation to online learning as well.
Thanks both. It just shows like the massive breadth of everything. I mean, personally, I had to swap laptops and I had to purchase Microsoft for my own laptop, which, you know, I was in the position to do. But if you needed to write your essay or anything and you had to purchase that, again, it's just another cost that you weren't expecting. So next question for you both is, has COVID changed any of your practices or made you relook at the services and support that you offer for students? Do you want to carry on in the same? So Leslie again?
No problem. Yeah, so as a direct impact or a direct response to our understanding of digital poverty at the beginning, we did change some of the access to our hardship funds and made that a bit easier for students who were able to apply. We provided services where we expanded the laptop loan scheme. We always had one in the library, I think some of you may have, where there's lockers and students can borrow the laptops for a couple of hours for use in the building. But now we were doing long-term laptop loans, and we continue to do that. And in fact, with the upcoming digital exams, we're now students can loan the cameras as well, because as part of the digital examination process, it takes regular photos to check that it is the student that is sitting the exam. So, but not everyone would have the technology to facilitate that, to make sure it was them. So that there's those ones is a direct impact of digital poverty. But more broadly, of course, we've had to change the way we've provided more broad student services because, like everyone else, everything suddenly had to be on a screen. And we've actually had a really interesting response to that. So what we learned in the first lockdown is that actually our not attending rate dropped, and actually the students were actually turning up to their appointments, because I think what the barrier that we had removed was actually travelling to campus, finding the location, doing that, actually walking in the door, which we know is actually quite hard for some individuals to do. So actually our attendance rate was way better. For us personally, I know that some institutions haven't necessarily seen this, but when we came into this academic year, we actually had fewer students coming forward for support. So We don't necessarily know the reasons for that, that we have advertised the services in the same way that we always would, and the students that need the support do appear to be finding us, but the numbers haven't been coming through in the same way. And more recently that has changed because we're coming up to exams and it's the time of pressure, dissertations and the rest of it. So we are seeing our numbers pick up, and by no means are the services quiet, but it just means that we haven't got that overwhelming number of students trying to access through. And going forward, I know you didn't quite ask this, Lisa, but I think it's interesting to start the conversation, is that going forward, we think that we actually want to learn from some of these things that we've identified. So for some students, actually, they like that they can be at home and have their counselling session and access it on screen. It might feel to them like they're in their safe space and they can have that conversation. For others who are probably experiencing the same difficulties we were just talking about, shared workspaces, not enough space, actually that could be the worst thing possible for them, is to try and find a quiet space to have that conversation. So going forward, what we're anticipating that we'll do is we'll offer students the choice, and then they can choose whether they fancy an in-person or an online, and that will also allow us to offer flexibility for our staff, which is good for their own well-being and not feeling that they have to be tied into the campus the whole time. So probably we've not done too much innovative stuff in relation to our services. I think we've responded in the way that most other universities have, but we're really keen to actually learn from the things that have worked and not just think, well, that was just a moment in time, a blip, and we'll just go back to only on-campus services, because I think it's gone to show that we don't have to do that, and there are lots of different ways of being able to support our students, and we're keen to learn from it.
Thanks, that's so true as well. People do like situations in a different way, and if it makes them feel safe, then definitely worth carrying on. Mari, how about you?
So I want to point out the obvious point here, that I am representing an online platform. And so talking about digital poverty might seem like a bit of an odd thing for us to do. So I just want to acknowledge that there will be students out there who are unable to access help on TSR, who might not know about TSR. And I don't want to claim that we're necessarily representing everyone that there is to represent, but I hope that, I think we get a pretty good sort of cross-section of experiences in our community, kind of regardless. So I think that is, the place I can talk from in relation to this. In terms of our processes, I suppose we're a little bit different to a university, but it is interesting how the pandemic changed things for us. Obviously, we're an online platform, so we all existed online anyway, so sort of our core sort of product didn't change that much, but the way that we support students has changed, I would say. It's, TSR has always been important in terms of giving reassurance to students, in terms of providing that space where they can come together and support one another, and also in terms of providing some expert advice in things like, uni applications and things like that. But the pandemic just changed things in terms of especially how organizations and people like the government, for example, people that wanted to be able to support students who might have normally done that through existing structures like schools or universities, were a little bit less able to do that and to speak to students as directly as they might have been able to, or to educate teachers so that the teachers can then give those messages to students. And I'm sure you'll remember that it was a time of deep, deep confusion back last year, when lots was changing all year for students, for teachers, for universities, for everyone. So a huge part of our role actually became trying to translate all of that information that was coming through that was super relevant to students, and especially relevant to those students that were applying to uni. So those year 13s from last year, our current first year students, who were trying to navigate an application system, a results-day system, all of that sort of stuff that was changing like minute by minute at one point. So a large part of our role became really sort of taking those bits of information that were coming that necessarily weren't very student friendly, and sort of making them a bit more student friendly, and trying to decode a little bit of that information so that all students are able to access the same kind of understanding about what was happening to them and to their educational experience. And we have always worked with partners. We've always worked with exam boards, with Ofqual, with UCAS, all of that sort of stuff, with mental health organizations, but those relationships became so much more important during the pandemic, and sort of the work that we were able to do across industry to support students. It was actually, to me, really humbling in terms of how we worked across, especially we work with some wonderful mental health organisations, and the work that we were able to do together, getting their advisors into the forum to support students with their mental health. And it's interesting, Leslie, what you're saying about, you know, for some people, online is actually great. For other people, it's not as good, but let's sort of meet students where they're at, I think, and make sure that we can try and give accessible information and support to everyone.
Lisa, can I just jump back in?
Yeah, of course.
I know that I explained what I did in my institution, but I was thinking it might be useful to share some of the examples from the research that we did. There were some really interesting, innovative things, I think, that were done that we picked up. I'll just touch on a few of them, if I may. There was one particularly that I liked, that a university had created an arrangement with a local supplier of technology and agreed what the standard of a laptop should be, so that students didn't have to try and guess and didn't get something that was too expensive and too much that they didn't need, and that they agreed kind of a set price for them. So the university did all of that negotiation. Obviously students can go wherever they want to buy a laptop, but if you remember back in the first lockdown, actually getting hold of some of this equipment was quite hard, and this company arranged for some refurbished equipment for them so that they could do it a bit cheaper for students. I thought that was quite a good scheme that came. There was some universities, so like I say, they sourced discounted rates, and there were others that actually went so far as did voucher schemes for purchasing equipment. So not just dishing out money and thinking that that was going to solve the problem, because I think sometimes you need to go beyond that. But some of the other things that the services that were enhanced, if you remember when I said, what does digital poverty mean to you? And some of it was around the confidence and understanding. So actually there was quite a lot of training and IT support, and actually trying to do that stuff. Again, money doesn't necessarily buy it, but it needs time with another human being to try and talk somebody through that troubleshooting and that kind of thing. And I really liked that some universities had gone beyond some of the obvious and thought kind of what is beyond this. And actually, so far as providing dongles where needed to try and deal with that Mari mentioned earlier about that intermittent internet and how disruptive that can be. And if you kicked off, you know, you've got to really have that self-control to jump back on again and not just think, oh, well, you know, today's not the day that I'm going to do that class. So I think there were some really interesting service provisions that came out of that. I just thought it was worth sharing. Yeah,
definitely. It's good to know that there's a lot of people thinking about it as well in the different universities, you know, because it is a problem for so many. Next question. I think we've covered this a little bit in the last question. What do you think is holding back the improvement of standards around digital poverty in higher education sector?
I think probably the main thing is that I don't think people really understand what it is yet. So even just this morning, we've just talked about the breadth of what digital poverty means. If we don't really understand the problem we're trying to fix, then how do we know what to do to put in its place? And I think also it's the thing that's quite difficult with this area, and something that came through in the research with Amoshi, was that you're trying to put a provision in place for people who might not necessarily want to come forward, or who might not want to admit that there's a problem, because actually that's makes them quite vulnerable, or might give them the feeling that they're quite vulnerable to come forward and ask for help, in the same way that we see for everything. You know, some students don't want to disclose that they've got a disability, some students don't want to tell us they've got a mental health problem. I'm no doubt that there are a large number of students who don't want to tell us they can't afford a laptop. So it's exactly the same thing, it's just a different topic. And in fact, some of the universities said, because we asked about the uptake on some of the initiatives that were put in place. So these universities had great ideas and they did all of this effort to put out, and then the uptake was actually really small. And when there was one university in particular that did a telephone campaign, and they looked through the data and they looked through where the students lived and the polar quintiles, and then they made a campaign to call all the students that they thought would be most likely to be impacted. And actually some of the responses was, oh, I've got a laptop, I share it with my sister, but it's fine because I'm sure somebody's in a worse position and needs it more than I do. And so really trying to get through to students who actually very modest about what they need, or actually are used to their status quo and don't realize that with a little help it could make it a lot easier and their access to learning could be easier. So there's so many barriers, but I think the main thing is that this is new to us all. We're still talking about barriers to students disclosing their disability or disclosing their mental health, and we haven't solved those. This is now another card in that pack of new barriers that we need to consider, and we need to come up with new ideas and innovative ways to engage with our students. And I think probably over time we will learn. I mean, it's realistic to think that this dual learning is going to stay with us now. I think the students that are going to come up to us from school have had more of an exposure to it, so more of an understanding of what they may need in order to be able to engage. So I think it is something we will get better with over time. I just hope that maybe we get on top of it a bit quicker than we have some of the other subjects, because it feels like we're really leaving people behind, and we can't allow that to continue to happen.
Thanks, Leslie. Mari?
Gosh, I think that's such a good point that Leslie made about feedback. And it was one of the points I was going to make as well. It must be so difficult to get feedback from students. And I know from previous work that I've done that for some students, the only time they might give their university feedback is in the NSS, and that's not enough. Like we know that everyone wants to hear about students' experiences more often than that. But it must be quite hard, I think, to kind of be able to do that. And then you start thinking about those students who might not participate as much in things like online surveys if they're happening, or they might not take advantage of those opportunities that might be shared if they're not having that regular access to the digital world. So yeah, how do we get to them, especially in a pandemic? That phone call idea, that's amazing. I love that. I think another thing is that the pandemic has helped to hammer home is that digital poverty isn't just devices and Wi-Fi, like Leslie has already said. There's so much more to it than that, and I want to kind of come back to that a little bit later on in some other of the questions. Also, I think something that I feel like we fall into the trap of a lot is assuming that young people are digital natives. I hate that expression so much because I think it's so unhelpful. There's sort of this there's this kind of impression that young people are naturally able to use devices and technology and software, and that they can just pick it up. And I think certainly that's true in some senses, like mobile phones, for example. A lot of smartphones now are deliberately designed in an intuitive manner. And young people can pick them up super easily, but so can I, and so can my parents. So it's intuitive for humans, not just for young people. And I think the term digital natives, it tars everyone with the same brush. And if we're talking about digital poverty, you cannot tar all students with the same brush ever in relation to anything. In terms like that, I think really sort of, they don't acknowledge the experience of students who are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds who might struggle with access to things like technology, but not just access to technology. Digital literacy is something that we don't just naturally have digital literacy. Young people don't just naturally have digital literacy, and the skills that might be needed by young people to engage in a digital world with their social network, for example, are vastly different to the skills that they might need to be able to engage in an online learning environment. And they might not ever have had to develop those skills. It's not the case necessarily that at school before the pandemic that their learning was overly digital. They might have been mostly using, notebooks and physical books. We need to take into account that these are skills that need to be taught. It was interesting, I was in a conference yesterday, which was with some further education colleges, and one of the principals was talking about the fact that one of the things that had shocked them the most was the digital skills that their students didn't have. And that there was a whole program, Leslie, you talked about this as well, a whole program in terms of equipping those students with the skills that they needed, making sure that they have digital toolkits in terms of how to not just access certain things on a computer, but how to be professional when you're on video, how to be confident, how to take part in all of the things that they were being asked to take part in that wasn't necessarily natural to them. And I think for a lot of young people, the blending of their learning world, their home world, and their digital worlds into one place in the pandemic was actually quite uncomfortable and actually quite difficult. So I think that's definitely something to take into account. Another example was with the additional assessment materials, which were released at the beginning of last week, I think it was. And all these additional assessment materials for GCSE and A-level students who are doing their exams this year were released by exam boards. And we had our forums full of young people questioning, how do I get access to these? They're in zip files. How do I download a zip file on my phone? How do I find this particular kind of document? How do I navigate this structure that they've been saved in? And the way that a lot of these things were communicated, it isn't naturally the way that a lot of young people would be able to find, digest, make use of that information. So there's also situations where assuming that all young people are digital natives is potentially going to be embedding disadvantage that was already there and kind of exacerbating that issue, because students do not have equal access and equal digital literacy, and we need to make sure that we're addressing that.
Thanks, Mara. Yeah, we did talk about zip files the other day, didn't we? And I actually had to create one the other day, and I've not done it for that long. I had to like look up how to do it because I'd not done one for that long. So next question, which I think again we've probably covered a little bit, with students getting ready to return or start in September, is there any advice on how universities and students can prepare to avoid any digital poverty becoming an issue before they get there?
I think for us, specifically in relation to the digital poverty, I think what we've learned is that students are still telling us now that it's quite hard to find information on our laptop loan scheme, for example. And actually they need to know that there's a laptop loan scheme to know to look it up. So there's something around getting the information to students probably before they start as part of their induction material. We didn't really do that last year. Remember, everything was kind of last minute. We weren't really sure how it was going to go. And we sent out, I think last year we sent out separate notifications around the laptop loans instead of embedding it into the communications that everyone gets. And on the basis that I've just said that we've got a whole load of students who probably think, oh, I'm okay, somebody else is worse off, why would they even open that email to start with? And actually, digital poverty is not a sexy name for students, is it? So we need to call this something different when we're talking around trying to get our students to engage with it. But one of the other things that I keep hearing myself saying in my institution is that I'm really interested about students who new students who are coming directly from school in September into university, because they've had a very different lockdown experience to the students that came into us last September. So if we think back to 2020, what happened in March is that everyone down-tooled, A-levels were cancelled, and those students just stopped. They just didn't do anything. They didn't have to engage with any learning at that stage. They effectively finished school early and did nothing, or I'm sure they did something very worthwhile and valuable, until they joined university in September. Whereas this year's students have had 15 months of disrupted and online learning. So I've actually, bearing in mind what Mari has just said around, if somebody's already in digital poverty, this has exasperated it, but actually they will have had use and access to the systems and had some online learning. My children are in school and I see them. My daughter is a brilliant independent learner. I cannot believe how she's embraced this, given a bit of information and going off and doing it. And I do think that she's going to have a much easier ride into university than some of the students last year who just actually came to us in September and said, like, well, how do I access Zoom or Teams or any of this stuff, because they hadn't had to use it. So I do think there are some big differences between last year's students and this year's students, and I'm talking only about the ones who come directly up from school. I do know that our students are much broader range than that. So I think there are some learnings that we can take. I think it's specifically around the communications around this area and trying to get our students to engage in it now that we know what some of the barriers are that we spoke about a bit earlier, and actually to maybe be able to play on the fact that they've had a very different experience and they might know a bit more of the question. They might be asking different questions this year than last year, and we need to be prepared for that. And I think if we get our heads around it a bit now, then we might not be such a shock come September.
Thanks, Leslie. Mari?
Sorry, just finding my mute button. Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I think when we're talking about avoiding digital poverty becoming an issue, I think we need to remember that it's not about avoiding it, it is an issue. So it's about addressing an issue that already exists. Also, I read a quote the other day. I think it was a social media quote, but I thought it really kind of hit home for me. And it was about the pandemic, and it was saying, we're in the same storm. Let's not pretend we're all in the same boat. We're not all in the same boat, and students aren't all in the same boat. So while there might be a lot of students who've been actually really benefited by, as Leslie was saying, this, 12, 18 months of sporadic home learning and long periods of home learning, if you're a student who has struggled that whole time, and if you're a student who has disadvantages that aren't just related to access to digital, but also related to their home circumstance, for example, also related to any number of other issues that we know might contribute to a student struggling to access education to the same level that others might, then we could be getting students who some have had quite an empowering time where they've managed to develop skills that will really help them, and we might have students who have had exactly the opposite and who might need that extra support. And I think the point you made earlier, Leslie, about how do we make sure we can identify those students who do need that extra support is a really good one. And I think that's something that you're right, we have to be prepared for. They might be asking different questions this year. It might be a bit of a different kettle of fish, and that feedback piece I think is super, super important. Also, I think something I would say is, as much as possible, to take a holistic approach to acknowledging digital poverty and acknowledging the impacts that it might have on a young person, and the role that digital plays in different sorts of young people's lives as well. I heard a really good example the other day of a project that Lancaster Uni did back at the beginning of the pandemic, where they funded a whole bunch of laptops for local schools so that those students were able to access their online learning. But interestingly, which was an amazing thing to do, obviously, but interestingly, when they looked at it, I think they did 500 laptops and 500 connections to the internet for these students. But when they looked at it, only 123 were being used. And of those, only 50% were being used regularly. And so they looked at sort of why that was. And I think that the massive takeaway from it was that just because a kid has a laptop and an internet connection doesn't necessarily, that doesn't take into account everything else that might be happening for that student. So the cool thing that they did next was that the school worked with a whole bunch of partners and organizations to develop training, to think about the cultural, the home circumstances, all the other circumstances that might impact a young person's life, to do training for teachers, to do training for parents, to do training for kids, and to take a really holistic approach in terms of making sure that not only did you have a device, but you were equipped with the ability and the confidence to use the device as well. And I think confidence and motivation is something that is going to be coming up a lot. We see it on the forums all the time. Young people who are struggling to have confidence in the decisions that they're making about their futures at the moment, and young people who are really struggling with motivation. And I'm pretty sure everyone here could probably relate after such a long time working from home, and it can become quite tedious. And then for students as well, they're not immune to that. It can become really difficult to continue engaging. And imagine trying to be excited about your future and making those big decisions, and that's that's the deal. But so much of their world is still in uncertainty. So I think that is going to probably continue, and I think access to online learning is part of that as well, and kind of staying motivated to continue taking part in online learning. And yeah, just to reiterate, and to finish the story actually about the Lancaster Uni project, they did all of the training, and then they ended up getting a 92% engagement rate in their learning, which I thought was amazing from the students who received those devices. So I think it just goes to show that there's a lot that can come from taking into account the humans and the circumstances and all of those sorts of things when looking at digital poverty.
Thanks,
I think
Laura.
that's everything for me.
I will say there as well, and if you're not used to using that particular type of laptop, then that obviously can be a problem, because they're all set out so differently, and Macs, I mean, they're completely different to Microsoft. So again, even the tech being a different type of technology can throw you completely for a while, can't it? So yeah, got to think of all these things. So final question from me. The Protected Code of Practice covers and looks at issues impacting students' wellbeing and mental health. I know we've touched on this a little bit, but do you think that the worry and stress caused by digital poverty has had an impact on the students' mental health as well?
Oh, well, there's no doubt that that is the case for some students, but whether we can ever identify them or tangibly evidence that, I think might be a bit more tricky. We've known and we've spoken around it in the student services world for quite some time, that we know that there's a direct link between students that are struggling with their finances and their mental health, because we all know what it's like. Something can become all encompassing and then it can affect you in ways that is quite hard to identify. And there is no doubt that somebody experienced some of these barriers we've been speaking about this morning in relation to digital poverty would have exactly the same output. But then, as we've spoken about, you've got your polar opposites, and I think that's the one thing that's my massive takeaway from COVID, is whatever our topic of conversation is at the moment, you've got people on different ends of the spectrum. So you've got some, as Mari said, that have flourished and have learned new skills and are just loving life and just kind of, what is the problem? And then you've got the complete opposite of people who really need help, and I just hope that they are able to access that help. And I guess that's our job, is to make sure that we're there and as visible as possible for students, that even if they don't identify that it's related to digital poverty, if they can identify that they've got something that they need a bit of support with, that they come forward.
Yeah, definitely. Amari, have you got anything to add?
So many things. I love talking about mental health. It's nice. Apology if I go a bit off track, but I think something that is really important to recognize is the interplay of technology and social relationships, and that lack of access to technology doesn't just impact education, but it impacts relationships, it impacts friendships, it impacts access to mental health services, it impacts all sorts of things. And the world that young people can live in can be super, super digital. And if you're not part of that, then that can have a really sort of lasting impact. And we all know how isolating the past 12, 18 months have been. So for a young person, if they're not able to take part in those parts of their lives that are so important, or even the fact that they're just limited to only being online. We saw so many discussions about, you know, difficulties like relationships that suddenly became long distance, even though they lived, you know, in the next town, and dealing with the impact of those things, and the fact that technology can be really helpful, but it can also be really difficult, and it removes a huge amount of that personal interaction. And yeah, if you don't have it, that's an even more difficult thing to deal with. I wanted to give a little bit of context about, in relation to two polls that we have run during the pandemic. One of them is in general around mental health, and this poll doesn't ask specifically about digital poverty, but it asks more generally about what factors are impacting your mental health most right now. So this has been running just the past couple of weeks. It actually just finished, so this is super new information. So we had just over 5,000 votes. And the first thing that was impacting their mental health the most was uncertainty around their education. The second thing was lack of purpose or motivation. The third thing was uncertainty around their future prospects. And then, like, very high up the list was also a lack of confidence in making big life decisions and worry about missed opportunities due to the pandemic. And the reason I wanted to mention this is because that young people are dealing with all sorts of things right now that are really, really difficult. Like, being a young person is difficult, like, anyway. Like, it's hard. It's hard doing the whole going to uni thing. It's hard working out what you want to study. It's hard dealing with all of those things and growing your resilience and your emotional toolkit. Like, all of those things are already challenging when there's not a pandemic. So they've got those. They've got all these other things that they're worrying about as well in terms of the pandemic. And then you think about students who are struggling to access human connection and support, or have been struggling to access it for the past 12, 18 months, to kind of like put on top of all of those other things that they're thinking about. So when it comes to mental health, digital and access to online can be an amazing tool that can help broaden young people's ability to access support. It can do wonderful things, but where you don't have that, that can make it really difficult to manage existing mental health concerns that they may have already had. So it could have exacerbated things in that way. Another poll I just wanted to talk about briefly was in relation to why students weren't turning their cameras on in lessons. So this poll was focused more at younger students, so kind of GCSE and A level, but I thought it was really interesting context in terms of there was an article that came out that suggested that students from disadvantaged backgrounds were less likely to turn on their cameras during lessons because they were embarrassed about their home situation. And so that was resulting in them being less able to engage in online learning. And I read this article and I was like, I wonder if that's true. I wonder if this is what students really think. And so we asked the question, and what came out was that actually it's so much more complicated than that. It's definitely, it's not just about I'm embarrassed about my background, although that does feature. So when we asked them, basically what came across in a lot of the comments was they were really uncomfortable about the fact that suddenly all their school classmates and their teacher could see into their worlds, no matter what their world was, but that sudden you're in my world and I don't have a choice about it. And it's not like on Instagram, like it's not like where they can, you know, they can set it up to be a certain way, or there's a huge pressure to look a certain way on camera or to be a certain way on camera. And that was sort of a blend that a lot of young people were quite uncomfortable with. So the reason most people didn't turn their cameras on at 37% was because they were self-conscious about showing their face. The second at 28% was because nobody else did. And the third at 10% was because they were embarrassed about their background. So when it comes to talking about the role that digital plays in relation to mental health, there's lots to consider there. And for students who might be dealing with additional pressures in their background, you know, it might be to do with their background, it might be to do with that they don't have a dedicated study space, it might be to do with all sorts of things. So that kind of digital poverty element really sort of can add to a lot of pressures that young people are already dealing with at the moment.
Thanks both. Thanks. I mean, we've covered quite a lot there, and I'm sure we could talk about it for a lot longer actually. We've had a few questions come in from the audience, which is great. So I'll ask the first one from Josh. So research shows students struggle financially and rely on their bank overdrafts or their bank of mum and dad to support them following them when they break their phone or laptop, etc. Research also shows that 48% of students don't have insurance in place, and only 7% have it in place with parents' home insurance. So with a larger portion of students suffering from digital poverty and financial poverty, do you think it's important that more universities, private halls, letting agents should be providing contents insurance free as part of their stay to ensure students are not left without their possessions? What do you think on that one?
Well, I know that, you know, as university halls, we provide that as part of their rent. I think it's always difficult when we try and put expectations on private companies or private landlords to provide that. Well, in an ideal world, of course, that would be lovely to be able to provide it. I think we're probably unrealistic that we would ever be able to put that pressure on. And probably what would happen is that the landlords would just put the rent up to cover it, and then the landlords that don't have it the students are often price driven, particularly the ones that don't have much choice with their finances. So I wonder if you might end up with unintended consequences by trying to do that. I think from a university, what we can do is just be more open about how students can access hardship funding or support as they need it. And I think maybe there is a bit of communication, and maybe someone like the student room could help in trying to get parents and families to understand that they can do an extension on their home insurance if they are in a position to do that, because of course some poverty obviously comes from the family and not necessarily just as the individual. So I think probably it does sound like it would be a nice idea. I'm just not sure in reality if that would ever happen.
Thanks, Leslie. Mari?
I mean, I'm going to make a bit of a utopian suggestion here. Wouldn't it be wicked if the companies that sold the devices to students could take into account that these are students who might need things like insurance on their devices and sold that as something that was included? You know, like student benefits are meant to be a thing to support students in their education. Wouldn't it be amazing if, you know, I completely take what Leslie is saying. I think if that doesn't feel like it's possible, gosh, wouldn't it be great if, you know, the Apples of the world could extend to the Dells and all of those sorts of companies could extend to helping students in a way that, you know, doesn't discriminate and offers that service that is so important. Of course, we will break our stuff, we'll break our phones, break all of those sorts of things. Sometimes they break, you know, and they should be able to be replaced, and maybe students don't have the resources to be able to follow up from that perspective as well. So wouldn't it be cool if there was just generally some better device support packages coming from those large, relatively large organizations who might be able to help students? Just throwing it out there.
So we have another question from Caroline. So have you had any issues of cybercrime or cyber safety that have impacted A students or B staff?
I want to touch so much wood here and just say that we are lucky that it hasn't happened to us yet. I've heard some awful stories in the press of other universities that have been targeted on large scales. I think probably each university has got examples of some students that have fallen victim to some kind of online scams. What we do at Brunel is that we test our students periodically, so we set up scams to see it is all ethical, don't worry, Mari. And we do it for our staff and students, and then when they click on the link, that what actually takes them to is a page going, this could have been a scam, like, be careful. So they are properly tracked through, and so it's our way of trying to educate. We don't do them very often, it's all very controlled. I feel terrible now saying that. Well, we're not meant to do it. So we do this to try and educate our students. So I don't know if I've got any specific examples, but our cyber team have been telling us that the more that we continue with dual delivery of education, and the more that we continue down this track, there probably are further actions that we should take. We train our staff on how to kick people out of a Zoom if they've managed to get in there by accident. We have had a few disruptive jumping on things, but very few of them really. This is all new, so every time one happens it feels like it's quite big because people aren't quite sure what to do with it, but over time I think we are getting better to respond with that. So I haven't got any horror stories to share with you, just kind of little odd bits and bobs.
Hopefully.
My face was saying that is so cool. I love that you do that. I'm sure it's all ethical. It's fine, but I think that's really cool. What a good idea. I feel like we all need a good bit of that sometimes. In a general sense, I don't have the statistics on me, but I know that there's been research that's been done which has shown a rise in online crime since the pandemic. And the thing about, in like the online safeguarding world, they're called bad actors. The thing about bad actors, people who, you know, seek to commit crime or to disrupt online, is that they're really good at adapting to situations very quickly. And when something like a pandemic happens and people are online so much more, you know, the ability for these organizations who are doing the wrong thing on the internet to adapt and to take advantage of that is pretty unreal. So I'm sure that there are statistics that will tell you that crime has gone up online as a result of the pandemic and people being online more. And I, you know, in terms of how we deal with that, we always have worked with the police. We escalate things where necessary, and I'm sure that, you know, most platforms are exactly the same. I think in terms of something that is interesting to me to consider, when I was in this further education event yesterday, they were speaking about safeguarding from an online perspective, and how do you safeguard students when they're not physically with you. And that, you know, rates of disclosures had gone down a lot. Reports from schools and colleges to the authorities had decreased by 77%, I think they said, in the past year. So in terms of, you know, safeguarding disclosures and things like that, I think there are some real challenges in terms of how do you identify potential safeguarding issues with students who aren't physically with you, and still try and encourage them to feel like there's a place that they can seek support if they are experiencing crime or harm, either online or offline. So making sure that even if that student maybe never physically steps foot in campus, you know, I know that there's a lot of both further education and higher education institutions who are looking more and more at completely online courses and things like that. How do you still make sure that that young person can still receive, or that student can still receive, the support that they need, and that their, you know, their tutors can know them and support them, and all of that sort of stuff. So I think there's definitely, you know, work to be done in a general sense there. And I hope that that's one of the great things that comes out of this pandemic, is that we can improve the quality of services both in the real world and online so that everyone can access it.
I'll unmute myself. We've still got a couple of questions left, and we're obviously running out of time. So I'll get through as many as I can. So sorry to anyone who we miss off. Next one was, students will have a specific needs and requirements, and these will vary depending on the context. So whether they're participating in large online meetings, a workshop or counselling session, etc. Do you have any evidence of digital service providers seeking to develop services that are better meet student needs? So I suppose, like, obviously we're using Zoom and everyone's been using Teams, but is there any other platforms that you've heard of that?
I'm not sure I'm great at answering this, but what I have noticed is that even Zoom and Teams have developed things like now you can get the transcript and you can enable the live captioning, which wasn't around at the beginning. And you'll know that the digital accessibility guideline law came into effect last September, and I suspect it was probably a move towards some of those things. So whereas we had been saying don't use Teams or don't use Zoom because it's not got the live transcript, but it's got the breakout rooms, and Teams didn't have the breakout rooms but did have the live transcript. Is it that way around? Anyway, and they all seem to be catching up with each other and developing, but I don't know of any other specific systems to help beyond that. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sort of similar, to be honest. I think from what I hear, lots of institutions and colleges have been using Teams and things as well. And I noticed that they just are updating throughout the pandemic. And I hope, you know, especially from an accessibility perspective, I hope that they continue to do that, including when students do go back more in person. I really hope that there are organizations, and maybe it's Teams and maybe it's Zoom and maybe it's a whole new player that might come in and really revolutionize the online learning space. And in my opinion, that would just be great.
Yeah, I mean, they have changed as the years gone on, haven't they? So it's been quite good, actually. So I'll probably do this as the final question from Jonathan. And we also have to be prepared that not all students will be 18 years old, going full-time, moving to campus, etc. As many people have lost jobs and there is a push for retraining. We will have a number of mature students coming back into education that may not only be made difficult by the time they've had away from learning, but also they're coming in to a new way of being taught and learning, and all of this could be alongside part-time work. So how do we support those students? I think we actually talked about this when we were talking about the event, didn't we?
Yeah, so this is really interesting, and I'm sorry, did you say it was Jonathan? You've highlighted some of the barriers maybe there for mature students, but actually some of the positives is that while the delivery is online, particularly for us being in West London, basically anywhere in London it takes you an hour to get to it, weirdly. Actually they don't have that travel time back and forth, so we are finding that our mature students and our commuter students are saying that they prefer it because actually they can engage in a way that it doesn't take so much time. Also, by recording the sessions and having them available, it means that those who have got quite a packed life anyway are able to engage with their learning around their own availability. So while we have got some drawbacks, and I think things like using technology they've not come across before are barriers we're seeing across the board, not necessarily just mature students. So we can do things about that. We've spoken already about training, we've spoken about ways that we can try and engage people and upskill them in that kind of regard. But I think that we should also be trying to think of what the positives are for them as well, and try and think of it as a whole package, so it's not all negative things in relation to some of our other groups of students.
Thanks, Leslie. Mari?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just agree with a lot of what Leslie has said. I think on the point that you made around students who are coming to university under 18, I think for those young students, for any student that's coming straight from school into university, there's a whole lot of uncertainty about what their university experience is actually going to be. And what's difficult is that there's the same uncertainty for universities because based on government guidelines, you know, things can change. But I think any level of certainty that we're able to give, or any level of reassurance, communication, gathering feedback, etc., that universities are able to give to incoming and current uni students, I think just would be very gratefully received by them. And yeah, in terms of managing things like, you know, part-time work and just all sorts of other other pressures, you know, that students have had, especially being at home with families. Young people might have found themselves being the primary carer for their younger siblings, for example, while parents are out working or they're at home. You know, there's all sorts of places that students will be coming from this year. And I think that to me, that's why it just comes back to, we have, like, we're in the same storm, we're not in the same boat. And I think universities having their eyes peeled and student support teams having their eyes peeled for the students that we think might fall into these vulnerable places and being able to support them, but also having our eyes open for those students that maybe we didn't expect to be in a vulnerable place, and being able to support them as well, and making sure that all the services that are there for them are super highlighted to all students, and hopefully we'll be seeing, you know, the uptake of all of those services.
Thank you both, and thank you to everyone for your questions and for attending this Protected Reflection session. Thanks so much, Leslie and Mari, for being with us this morning and sharing all your knowledge and experience. Obviously, as usual, we could probably carry on for another hour, I think. So the video of this morning's session will be made available on the ProtectED website, so you can view it again if there's anything that you want to go back and take a look at. And we'll also be having another session on the 20th of May that will be looking at the problems that are facing international students when they come back in September. So that obviously will be quite an interesting session as well. So thanks again, everybody. Really appreciate your support and that you've come along to the session. I thought it was really good. So thanks for all your insights, ladies. Appreciate it. Take care.